Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Georg Kabierske, who is a Ph.D. student at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, but in Marburg. I know, I see Munich, but I know it's Marburg, sorry. But in Piranesi circles, he's known for an amazing discovery. I'm going to embarrass him. I'm sorry, Georg. Back in 2014, as a then 19-year-old intern at the museum in Karlsruhe, Georg realized that the two large volumes of drawings, long thought to be the work of the local architect Friedrich Weinbrenner, were in fact nearly 300 drawings drawn by Piranesi and his studio. Particularly for those of us interested in Piranesi's working practice, this was an extraordinary new body of evidence. And personally, Georg and I spent a couple of fantastic days looking together through the albums, and he's been a truly generous colleague, sharing the work in progress as he and the others cataloged the albums in Karlsruhe. That work has shed light not only on Piranesi, but perhaps even more on his assistants and associates. And it's on one of those associates, Nicolas Lhuillier, that Georg focuses today. Please welcome to the podium.
Many thanks for the kind and generous introduction. Dear John, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to speak here in New York following the kind invitation of the Morgan Library. Thank you so much for having me. Little noticed by scholars until recently, the French draftsman Nicolas Lhuillier played a central role in the dissemination of antique architectural ornament in the circle of Piranesi in Rome and beyond from mid-18th century onwards. Starting point for an in-depth study of his drawings and oeuvre was the reattribution of two albums with over 297 drawings from the estate of the German neoclassical architect Friedrich Weinbrenner to the studio of Giovanni Battista Piranesi in the Staatliche Kunsthalle Karlsruhe in 2014. The albums, 2 pages shown here, contain drawings by Giovanni Battista himself and several other hands, forming an abundance of motifs on which Piranesi based his designs and prints. Among other relations, this material is closely connected with the Piranesi collection at the Morgan Library. Both convolutes, each remain together to this day, seem to originate from the same source. Following my first publication in master drawings in 2015, our interdisciplinary research project dug up many more connections to other international connections from Piranesi and his contemporaries, leading to an online publication allowing to browse through and download this rich material in full detail. I owe our team with Professor Irene Brückle, Maria Krämer, Dorit Schäfer, Astrid Reuter, and especially Christoph Frank, as well as Benedict Maroni, my heartfelt thanks for an open exchange leading to discoveries I'm able to present here today. I extend my thanks also to Christian Bollès, former chief curator for the Palace of Versailles, for sharing with me his research on Lhuillier he did in Parisian archives. For introduction, back to the Karlsruhe albums. There, a group of mostly large-scale studies of architectural ornament and ancient bas-relief stand out, executed in red or black chalk, many to perfection. I was stunned to find out that reworked counterproofs of the Karlsruhe drawings found their way in the estate of the British architect James Adam, traveling to Rome in the early 1760s, now in the Sir John Soane's Museum in London. They are given to a French draftsman, Nicolas François David Lhuillier. But who was this guy? His correct name is in fact Nicolas François Daniel Lhuillier, born in 1736 in Paris to a family with 3 older sisters, one of them married to a tailor. His mother was Marie Elisabeth Delaborde, who came from a family of pewterers. In 1751, when he was 14 years old, his father died, also called Nicolas. The father's specific profession is so far unknown. A French source mentions him in a vague way as a praticien. After this sad event, the boy Nicolas was placed under the guardianship of his maternal uncle, Etienne Delaborde. The friends attending the act were Marchand Mercier and two Marchand Frangé. Accordingly, Lhuillier came from an artisanal background, nothing that could explain his future career. It must have been in the same year, 1751, that Lhuillier, aged 14, left Paris for Rome. As mentioned in an advertisement for his later published Livre d'Ornaments, he stayed there for 17 years, where he specialized in drawings, architectural details in antique style, and came in contact with Clerisot, Winkelmann, and Piranesi, among others. Together with the French sculptor Laurent Guyard, he returned to Paris in 1768. Immediately after his arrival, he began working there as an ornamental sculptor and was one of the first to realize interior decorations in a neoclassical antique taste for renowned architects and clients from the high society of that time, including François-Joseph Bellanger, Claude Nicolas Ledoux, or the Comte d'Artois. Furthermore, he published print series on antique ornament and collaborated with renowned bronziers and decorators such as Gautier, Tourmire, or Rousseau de la Rotière. In Paris, he died unmarried on June 8, 1793. No portrait is so far known of him. In 18th century Rome, there was a high demand for drawings documenting decoration of antique and modern architecture. Among the travelers to Italy, especially architects and sculptors compiled collections of drawings to use them as inspiration for decorating their own future neoclassical buildings or interiors. However, several problems appear in the process. There was, for example, the time required to make detailed drawings by hand, leading for those who could afford to an employment of specialized draftsmen. A major obstacle was the difficulty of getting close to the architectural details of the monuments, since during the second half of the 18th century, almost no permits were issued for the erection of the necessary scaffolds, a topic that Frank Salmon addressed in an essay in 1995. Without scaffolding, on the other hand, the only option was to lean a ladder on the columns and climb up with the measuring rod, as ironically depicted in a drawing by the Englishman Henry Parkey at the beginning of the 19th century. However, this led to problems of accuracy. In addition, accidents could happen anytime. Therefore, it was attractive and much easier to draw after plaster casts and copy already existing drawings, or to acquire such from specialized draftsmen. This was the situation in which Lhuillier was active in. In Rome at the time, one of the most important figures was Charles-Louis Clerisot, who studied Roman antiquities and was widely connected among other artists, architects, and grand tour travelers, including Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Mostly in pen and vivid watercolors, Clerisot drew antique ruins and architectural fantasies, but also decoration in detail. Looking back, Piranesi's biographer Jacques-Guillaume Legrand wrote in his Notice historique of 1799, and I quote, "Clerisot was training a sculptor of ornament who also became very skilled, the late Lhuillier. This teacher," meaning Clerisot, "directed his studies in Rome on the most beautiful ornaments, developed for him the principles of which he had made a particular study, and procured him for considerable work for various Englishmen with whom he, Clerisot, was in correspondence. Lhuillier returned to Paris with a perfect knowledge of the antique style and a rare ease for drawing," unquote. Apparently, his teacher's drawings of architectural ornament appealed to Lhuillier in particular because he specialized in the same subject, surpassing his master in the degree of plasticity effect. The contact seemed to have been established shortly after Clerisot had finished his training at the Académie de France in Rome in 1754 and started as a teacher of antiquities himself. So the earliest assumed beginning of Lhuillier's activity in Rome are the mid-1750s. How this came about is unknown. Lhuillier was not registered at any academy. Among the Englishmen with whom Clerisot was in correspondence were the Adam brothers. The already mentioned group in red and black chalk, collected by James Adam during his trip to Italy in 1760 to 1763, is preserved in volume 26 of the so-called Adam travel drawings in the Soane's Museum in London. The fact that Lhuillier had already drawn for the older Robert Adam, a friend of Piranesi, in 1756 is supported by a previously unpublished section of the Adam correspondence identified by Christoph Frank. In rough language, Robert Adam wrote to his younger brother, and I quote, "I have besides these three," meaning Draughtsman, meaning Clarisseau, Agostinho Brunias, and Jean-Benoit Devets, another beagle, likely Lhuillier, who is the most worthless young dick I ever knew, but draws ornament to perfection. He it is that I am to set about copying over all the things I have in a little book for you, that when here you may see what I have, and if there is any other thing that you'd wish to have done, he is one of four men at 1 shilling per day," unquote. Accordingly, Lhuillier was hired to repeat pre-sketched ornaments in perfect execution. In fact, many of the drawings preserved in the Soanes are reworked counterproofs. 3 of them are based on drawings that can be found in the volumes from Piranesi's workshop in Karlsruhe. Others were counterproofed from the identical model or do repeat the same motifs. And that's no coincidence either. Lhuillier also worked for Piranesi, as we will see soon. Bénédicte Maroni and Christoph Frank were able to prove for the first time in an essay published in 2019 that Lhuillier also worked in Rome for the Swiss architect David Vogel. His well-documented stay in Italy from 1763 to 1765 sheds light on the role Lhuillier played as a mediator of ornaments and the importance given to the studies of those. Set in contact with Johann Joachim Winckelmann, Johann Friedrich Reifenstein, and Clarisseau, Vogel possessed the best conditions for spending successful years of study. But differences of opinion and dissipation seem to have been the main reasons why David Vogel quickly lost the respect of his mentors Winckelmann and Clarisseau. Although he went with Lhuillier on trips around Rome, Vogel did not study ancient architecture through his own drawings on site. He rather took a more convenient way and had Lhuillier make drawings of ornaments for him at great expense, or copied after his sheets, as Reifenstein reports in 2 letters to the painter Johann Heinrich Füssli. Those drawings are kept in 2 albums in the Zentralbibliothek in Zurich, whereby an exact stylistic division between drawings of Lhuillier and Vogel's copies still demanding for discussion. Thus, when copying and learning how to draw, it was mandatory to imitate the style as closely as possible. Vogel's smaller album, a page shown here on the right, may contain such copies. One of the rosettes there is labeled "Composé par Monsieur Lhuillier" in Vogel's handwriting. But a counterproof of another sheet of this album is included in the collection in Karlsruhe, indicating an extensive circulation of drawings in the context of Piranesi's studio. Rosettes often reappeared during the time. They seem to have contained everything what was necessary for young students. Back in Paris, however, Lhuillier published ornamental prints as models for other artists and was invited to present his drawings to the assembled members of the Académie Royale d'Architecture in 1771. A year later, the Livre d'Ornement was published as a substitute for a way larger planned book which had failed. Additionally, he delivered till 1783 108 plates for the École Royale Gratuite de Dessin. But most interesting is the Recueil d'Ornements, published in 1777. Identical in size and style, it repeats a selection of drawings which Lhuillier drew in Rome and of which he must have taken replicas to Paris, as well as ornaments from royal palaces. The plates are signed with the monogram RL, which Peter Furing suggested to read as Rousseau and Lhuillier, referring to a former co-worker, the decorative painter Rousseau de la Rotière. Drawings in the style of Lhuillier come in different qualities and stages of elaboration. Many in same size as the finalized drawings, they could have served as preliminary studies that Lhuillier made in front of the sculptural relief, or they could be potential copies made by learning drawing students. And they were made over a long period of time. And this also applies to the own drawings by Lhuillier, who spent 17 years in Rome and learned to draw there himself. So, identification of hands is in fact a complex topic which still needs further studying. Characteristic of Lhuillier's style are the striking outlines as well as the parallel hatching made up of lines through whose more or less strong emphasis, volume, and shadow effect of the object are defined. In case of a larger surface, such as the background of reliefs, this hatching is composed of short vertical strokes, which in turn appear to be superimposed in slightly curved bands of lines. This creates a clear and precise image that is particularly suitable for copying. This rational drawing technique originates from a long tradition of drawing antiquities and was also used in the 18th century by other French draftsmen in the environment of the Académie de France in Rome and in Paris. Lhuillier is therefore not the inventor of this technique, but he spread and systemized it through consistent application in his ornamental drawings. In addition, Lhuillier's figures have round faces and soft, voluminous forms or robes. Although his drawings mainly depict decoration elements of ancient ruins, he does not attempt to emphasize the picturesque character in the sense of a capriccio. Instead, the drawings mostly provide an idealized and undamaged version of the decorative element that an artist or architect could use as a model for his own designs. But his drawing style was recognized at the time and even not forgotten in Italy around 1790. This is shown by an entry in the travel diary of Léon Dufourny, communicated to us by Pier Francesco Palazzotto. Dufourny is noticed in the collection of his fellow architect Giuseppe Venanzio Marvuglia in Palermo, and I quote, "A very beautiful series of ornamental studies and architectural fragments drawn in black chalk on blue paper in the manner of Lhuillier. The most beautiful pieces to be seen in Rome are drawn there. It is one more merit to have done this work at a time when these magnificent remains of ancient architecture were little appreciated and when Piranesi had not yet attracted the attention of artists with his beautiful plates." Dufourny's commentary highlights the importance of Lhuillier's drawings, which were already in circulation before Piranesi recognized this economic potential for his own archaeological and ornamental publications. Marvuglia's drawn compendium, one sheet of which is also inscribed with the name Lhuillier, is now in the private Archivio Palazzotto in Palermo. It still needs to be investigated whether these are copies made by Marvuglia after Lhuillier, with whom he had apparently contact during his studies in Rome in the 1750s, or by the Frenchman himself. Following our research, drawings in the manner of Lhuillier showing a repeating repertoire were found in numerous collections of European artists and architects listed here, among them Thomas Hardwick, Pierre Adrien Paris, Friedrich Wilhelm von Erdmannsdorff, or Johannes Wiedewelt. This is significant as it shows that many artists brought along from Rome very similar collections used as a base for the development of neoclassicism. This wide distribution came about because Lhuillier's drawings were reproduced extensively by copying manually or counterproofing by himself, as well as by his drawing students and those who acquired the sheets. And even after his departure from Rome in 1768, they seem to have continued to circulate. With the use of a printing press and moisted paper placed on the drawing, the counterproof allowed to do side-inverted impressions. Those, as well as the original drawing, worn down in the process, could then be reworked manually and again counterproofed, leading to long chains of the same motif as seen here. By making a copy of a copy, the result is finally laterally identical again to the original drawing. Reworking strengthened contrast and details, but the sheet also received the spirit of a real drawing. And it's no coincidence that so many Lhuillier's drawings can be found in the material from Piranesi's studio, while copies or counterproofs ended up in other collections. Lhuillier also worked for Piranesi. A letter from the French architect François-Joseph Bellanger, whose most important co-worker Lhuillier was to become in Paris after his return, is significant here. In the context of the resale of Lhuillier's studio, Bellanger wrote on November 19, 1808, I quote, "Lhuillier, who had lived 22 years in Italy, actually only 17 years, who had studied this science with Jean-Baptiste Piranesi, whose drawings he made, even with Winkelmann, went with Guyard to Paris to execute various objects of ornaments. But to what extent, unquote, but to what extent did Lhuillier work for Piranesi? Was he an external collaborator who sold drawings to Piranesi, or, like Bellanger indicates, directly involved in Piranesi's projects? The drawings at the Morgan and in Karlsruhe may suggest the latter. There are, for example, two large drawings for the stucco ceiling of Santa Maria del Priorato, the church designed by Piranesi on the Aventine Hill. While an attribution to Lhuillier might be assumed by stylistic reasons, he could, after all, have played a greater role in the workshop as well and, thinking hypothetically, on the construction site of the church in 1764 to 1766. As he started immediately to work as a sculptor and stuccoist after his return to Paris in 1768, Lhuillier must already have learned the craft in Rome. But primarily, we find in the studio record drawings in the style of Lhuillier, such as rosettes, friezes, or reliefs. Some of them inscribed with locations in the handwriting of Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Even if Piranesi did not make the studies himself, it was important for him to note the origin of the motifs for his own archive. When we think about how Robert Adam describes Lhuillier's activity, maybe Piranesi also sketched those motifs at first on his own and then sent the Frenchman again on site to draw it in a clean and perfected manner. Especially in the case of figurative reliefs, which Piranesi used for his archaeological and ornamental etchings, a precise drawing was of great importance. Piranesi's own drawings may be particularly appealing to us today, but for the most part, they provide not a very detailed record of the antique sculpture. Therefore, drawings like the imperial eagle from the porch of the church Santi Apostoli became part of a large repertoire of decorative material that formed the essential basis for the elaboration of Piranesi's designs. The antique relief is executed in red chalk in Lhuillier's perfected style, imitating well the plasticity of the sculpture. In a second step, the drawing was reworked in red and foremost black chalk. Ambiguous elements, such as the feathers, the oak leaves, or the ribbons, were highlighted by bold outlines or strong strokes, and the cracks of the antique relief not previously present in the drawing were additionally documented. This ruthless intervention in the academic drawing was probably done by Piranesi himself, a step we can observe in several drawings from his studio. This is also supported by the fact that Piranesi recorded the inscription of the relief on the back of the sheet, maybe when he returned with the drawing on site. Where's the pointer? It's on top on the right. While Lhuillier idealized the ancient sculpture in a decorator's perspective, Piranesi's revision expresses his archaeological interest. Identical in size and details, it served for an etching printed for the first time in 1770 and introduced as a title page in the second volume of Varsi Candelabri in 1778. Likely most of the preparatory drawings for Piranesi's etchings, it is not inverted, leading to the hypothesis that this motif was transferred on the copper plate by counterproofing or by use of a tracing paper. However, differences in detail, like the oak leaves or the cracks, prove that the Karlsruhe sheet is by no means a drawing based on the etching. But before the drawing from Lhuillier was reworked by Piranesi, a counterproof was made, likely to store it in untouched shape. It is preserved in the collection of the architect Hans Caspar Escher, which forms the second part of the already mentioned large album of David Vogel in the Zentralbibliothek of Zurich. The Swiss architect Escher was a good friend of Friedrich Weinbrenner and studied with him in Rome. This explains why his collection, identified by Benedict Maroni, also contains material from Piranesi's workshop comparable to those from Weinbrenner's estate in Karlsruhe. However, the eagle from Santi Apostoli recurs also several times in Lhuillier's oeuvre after his return to Paris. In idealized state, Lhuillier published it in 1772 as an etching in his Livre d'Ornaments and realized it under the direction of François-Joseph Bélanger as sculpture on several occasions. Among them, at the rear facade of the infamous Pavillon de Bagatelle near the Bois de Boulogne, built for the younger brother of King Louis XVI, the Comte d'Artois. And there's also a lunette-shaped trophy you surely remember from the Morgans exhibition. For a design in diverse maniere, Piranesi took the sea dragons from the corners. A frieze in the style of Lhuillier, preserved in the Karlsruhe albums, was then used as inspiration for the mantle's lintel. As one of many examples, however, the lunette also shows the multi-layered context that was given to these drawings beyond their use in Piranesi's workshop. Long time thought to be a drawing by Piranesi, it shows one of originally 4 ancient reliefs coming from the Traianic Forum. 2 of them were installed as overdoors in the gallery of Parnassus at Villa Albani around 1760. In fact, the drawing is very close to the marble relief, but some changes appear odd. There's the turn of the sea dragon's neck in the flanking spandrels, which were taken from the other overdoor. Another important change is the pommel of the sword of the lower left, now showing a ram's head. This seems to reflect an independent design. The reliefs were published for the first time in 1759 by the Comte de Caylus. The trophies are, in fact, identical with today's appearance, but Caylus only shows one type of sea dragons, leading to suggest that the creatures might have been restored in some way when the reliefs came to Villa Albani. Now, there are numerous copies with similar changes, like in the Morgan sheet, kept in collections associated with Lhuillier or his teacher Clérisseau. Among them, also the relief's counterpart, of which once likely existed a red chalk drawing too. The Morgan's sheet, or a replica of it, as well as the lost drawing of the counterpart, seem to have been counterproofed and were then traced on oiled paper. Those tracings are kept in the estate of the architect Pierre-Adrien Paris in Besançon. Also worth mentioning is the side inverse representation of the relief in pen and wash from the former Sterling Maxwell collection, which contained many motifs connected with Lhuillier and Clérisseau. The drawings were once added to the Museo Cartaceo of Cassiano dal Pozzo, apparently shortly before the collection was sold from Rome to England through the mediation of Robert Adam in 1762. There, the sword pommel with the ram's head in additionally spirally turned modification that we also find in Lhuillier's Livre d'Ornaments. The relief's counterpart's drawing is in the collection of Clérisseau at the State Hermitage in St. Petersburg, followed by 2 copies in black chalk in the style of Lhuillier, one among the Adam Treville drawings, the other with Thomas Hardwick in the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. Even if Piranesi did not draw sheets like that himself, forming instead his archive of sources. They offer important clues in the understanding, the working practice, and organization of the workshop and made his wide-ranging designs and publications possible. The distribution of drawings, counterproofs, and motifs then highlights that collections of international travelers to Rome are linked among each other and to Piranesi's studio. My dear colleague, Bénédicte Maroni, is intensively studying this topic. She is currently writing her PhD on Piranesi's workshop. When Lhuillier returned to Paris in 1768, he took with him 500 to 600 drawings and a rare collection of plaster casts after architectural ornament, providing a precious source for his sculptural decor in Paris as well as for his colleagues. Bellanger approvingly reports that Lhuillier also brought an early copy of the Diverse Maniere to Paris, from which the architect then drew inspiration for his own fireplace designs. The whereabouts of these works are so far unknown. In addition to Lhuillier's activity as a sculptor, he seems to have continued to apply his high skills as specialized draftsman. This may be seen in a series of presentation drawings for the new dining room of Château de Maison Lafitte, decorated by Lhuillier according to Bellanger's designs. The drawings are signed Bellanger Invenit, but drawn in Lhuillier's characteristic perfected style in black chalk. Basically, there would be much more to say about the 25 years in which Lhuillier was then active in Paris, but in view of time, I have to conclude now. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
We turn now to Mario Bevilacqua's paper. Mario is professor of the history of architecture at the Sapienza University in Rome, and he too is the author of numerous important, even invaluable studies of Piranesi's work, especially, as Andrew mentioned, the 2008 critical edition of the 2 volumes of the Modena sketchbooks, many pages of which we've already seen today. Most recently, Mario is one of the editors, with Claire Hornsby, of the volume Piranesi at 300, the outgrowth of a conference held in Rome on the occasion of the artist's 300th birthday. But his work is ongoing, and he's part of the team now also preparing critical editions, not of Piranesi's prints, but of the texts that accompany them, something that promises to open another whole world of possibility for looking at our artist. Today, however, he focuses on Piranesi's architectural drawings. Mario.
Thank you, John. Thank you for inviting me to this symposium. Now, in his historisch-kritische Nachrichten von Italien, a very successful travel guide to Italy, published in Leipzig in 1770, the German writer Johann Jakob Volkmann wrote that, and I quote, "Piranesi is actually an architect, but in this book, I have often commemorated his excellent manner in etching and have made special mention of him in the list of Italian scholars. But we regard him as a scholar in view of his writings, although he is actually an architect." Volkmann was in Rome in 1758, a friend and correspondent of Winckelmann's. His definition of Piranesi as an architect is quite unexpected. Piranesi's actual contribution to built architecture is minimal, as we know. The tiny church of Santa Maria del Priorato. This is a winter view, but we've got a summer view as well. His intervention at the church, the tiny church of Santa Maria del Priorato, and the piazza in front of it being the only structure he ever managed to build. The grand proposals for the apse of the Cathedral of Rome, San Giovanni in Laterano, were probably never intended to be realized. Both were designed for the Rezzonico Pope Clement XIII and his family within a narrow span of time in the first half of the 1760s. Piranesi mentions them, both architectural commissions, in his Diverse Maniere di Adornare i Camini in 1769. Quote, the designs for the completion of the Lateran Basilica, but above all the Grand Priory renewed rather than restored. End quote. So how could possibly Volkmann write about Piranesi as an architect? He must have relied on Piranesi's subscribing. And these are the drawings for the Lateran. Piranesi subscribing architectus in the frontispieces of all of his works. He does not mention, Volkmann doesn't mention Piranesi's designs for the Lateran, but he does describe the Priorato. He mentions it's being embellished by Monsignor Rezzonico, but without any description, comment, or mention of the architect responsible for the restoration work. So while he is addressing Piranesi as, styling Piranesi as an architect, then once he could have the possibility of talking about his built architecture, he describes very quickly the architecture of the Priorato, but doesn't mention Piranesi. At that time, nobody had any clue of what Piranesi's ideas for the Lateran were, and only actual visitors to Rome could see the tiny church of the Priory of Malta. On the occasion of the Pope's official visit to the Priorato in October 1766, the ambassador of Malta to the Holy See, the Bailli de Berteuil, himself a patron of Piranesi, quote, known to be a gentleman of excellent taste, had occasion to say that if there were no other buildings than that of the Gran Priorato for the next 1,000 years, our descendants would undoubtedly say that during the 18th century, Romans had once more become barbarous. Rumors spread rapidly throughout the city and far beyond, and they were not favorable to Piranesi's work at all. In Naples, Luigi Vanvitelli commented on the news arriving from Rome, quote, Piranesi may be talented, but he is a complete madman. The expensive and inappropriate decorations that he created for His Holiness nephew do not therefore surprise me in the least, end quote. In Venice, the architect Antonio Visentini argued that, quote, Piranesi, who boasts the name of witty architect for having restored the Priory Church inside and outside, wanting to distinguish himself, imagined an architecture according to his whim and the ornaments proportionate to his poor judgment. The English architect and builder Richard Norris, who befriended Piranesi during his stay in Rome in 1770-72, visited the church twice, writing in his diary, quote, the church is, in my opinion, very bad, a strange composition of ornaments that mean nothing. And of course, we know that modern scholars have always debated so much about the iconographic meaning, the iconology of the decoration of Santa Maria del Priorato. It's funny to see a contemporary of Piranesi saying a mess of ornaments that mean nothing. Visentini in Venice and Vanvitelli in Naples had to rely on gossip, not images, to condemn Piranesi's architecture. The first and only print with a new facade available in the last decades of the 18th century was a small and rather coarse etching by Cassini, published in 1779, followed by a tiny front in Cipriani's illustrated itineraries through Rome in 1838. It's a booklet like this, and the facade of the Priorato, which you see up there, half of it is that small. No images of the closing wall and gate of the piazza were ever made available. In 1787, Francesco Milizzi, the fierce neoclassical censor, published the definitive death sentence of the Priorato, including it among the works of architetti nefandi, nefarious architects, whose names he does not even mention so as to condemn them to oblivion. Piranesi produced a whole series of drawings for the Priorato, and some of them we've seen in the exhibition downstairs, upstairs. All that survives, though, is related to stucco decoration, as the task he was asked to carry out was an overall coating of an existing late 16th century structure. Only the new invention of the high altar is rather well documented in all its stages, where we should imply some degree of authority and autonomy by the sculptor Tommaso Righi, responsible for the sculpture. There is just one general drawing for the... Doesn't work very well. Okay. There is just one general drawing for the piazza in front of the church, with an early stage of the new decoration of the existing structure of the main gate. The new piazza was opened according to Piranesi's instructions and under his supervision after April 1765, when Monsignor Rezzonico appealed to the Pope to be given permission to widen the narrow alley leading to the church, not suitable for the great assembly of coaches on St. John's Day. The report of the on-site visit in April 1765 stated the old entrance gate had already been renovated with stucco ornaments, while the old wall in front of it was to be raised and a new one was to be built according to Piranesi's measures. The height of the new wall was not to exceed the height of the old one, and the exuberant decoration that would be set on top of the new wall is never mentioned. We can only guess at the utter bewilderment of the neighbors at the raising of such flamboyant structure among green gardens and vineyards of what was then uninhabited Aventine Hill. The drawings of Santa Maria del Priorato, and these are the drawings, and these are working drawings measured, which fit exactly with what was then executed. By the way, I'm showing you pictures of the newly restored piazza restoration works, which finished a month ago. 3 drawings of Santa Maria del Priorato in the Soames Museum in London, belonging to the rich group of travel drawings of Robert and James Adam. We've already seen some of them in the speeches of my colleagues, are very interesting in their, I could say, ambiguity. They have been correctly recognized as copies after possibly Piranesi's finished drawings. They do not match perfectly well with what was then actually built. I tried to understand what was wrong, and the height, of course, was not correct. Here we have the right half part of the slide with a survey, with the actual survey, the model one, and the sewn drawing, which makes the church seem much taller than it really is. They have been correctly recognized as copies after possibly Piranesi's finished drawings. They do not match perfectly well with what was then actually built, and that makes them more intriguing. James Adam then left Rome in April 1763, perhaps too early to imagine Piranesi having already finished any drawings for Monsignor Rezzonico, who, after all, was elected as Grand Priore only in February that year. It has been suggested these drawings were executed under Piranesi's supervision and sent to the Adam brothers later. There are differences in the windows, in the frames of the windows, and some other details of the stucco decoration. It has also been surmised these drawings might be copies after preparatory drawings for etchings. But there are no clues as to Piranesi's intention to etch his two architectural endeavors, the Priorato and the Lateran. As for the former, he may have been stopped by the controversial reactions to his design. He never thought of including a view of the Priorato among the Vedute di Roma, and in his Plan of Rome and the Campo Marzio, a detail here, published in 1773, he did not even bother to update the detail of the topography of the new square. Here, the new square is here, and this is the narrow alley which was opened, copying the detail from the 1748 map of Nolli. So a total disregard for his own work. The renovation of the apse of San Giovanni in Laterano was a huge, on the contrary, was a huge, daring undertaking. The Pope dropped proposals from well-known professional architects active in Rome at the time to promote a controversial and inexperienced Piranesi. The story, as is well known, ended up in nothing. Piranesi knew the old basilica very well because he reproduced it in many of his works and in several vedute. But when it came to architecture, for such a demanding task, he could not do without technical drawings. This drawing, beautiful sheet, is up there in the exhibition, and we see he studies architectural features of the basilica, paying attention to the portal here of the palazzo and the bell tower of the church, so he knows it in detail. But when it came to architecture, designing the new apse of the church, he couldn't do without technical drawings. He must have used prints. He must have used, I am sure he used prints to analyze the proportions of the nave. Probably the large longitudinal cross-section published by Rasponi in 1656 after Borromini's restoration, followed by the one by Giovanni Giacomo de Rossi in 1684. The spectacular drawing at the Morgan is evidently based on these prints. Likewise, he used the plans of the basilica published in the 17th century by the same authors to verify measures and start designing his own projects for the Tribune. So he needed a survey of the church, and he found it. Of course, he didn't ask anybody to draw a new survey, but he used prints already available, and this is a detail of one of the drawings at the Morgan with a detail of the pillars of the main central nave of the church, where he uses the print to get the details. He doesn't measure the plan of the pillars himself, but then this is clearly his handwriting. So he checks measures on the spot using copies from prints. This is the detail of the Morgan drawing and this is a detail from the presentation drawings at the Avery Library. Unlike the Priorato, at the Lateran, Piranesi embarked on the time-consuming, demanding task of producing a set of large, detailed, and finely colored plates showing different proposals, from the simpler to the more complex and expensive ones. Not all of the 26 or 27 drawings were completed. They seem to have been hastily gathered together and presented to the Pope. These are the drawings of the Avery Library. So presentation drawings, finely colored, but not all of them are finished. Some of them are very sketchy, and so I think that they were hastily gathered together and presented to the Pope and his nephew, and they were kept with the Ritsonikos, who hanged them in their rooms at the senatorial palace, and then they took them to Venice until the dispersal of their collection in the first half of the 19th century. Then most of them reached, some of them Russia, but most of them America, sometime in the early 20th century, only to be published in 1972 once they were bequeathed to the Avery Library. So we could fairly say that Piranesi as an architect is virtually a 20th century discovery. Indeed, Piranesi's architectural practice was not only criticized and despised. Soon after his death, it was virtually forgotten. The first contribution on Piranesi as a practicing architect was published by German art historian Werner Körte in 1933, a very straightforward survey with good photos of the Priorato. No drawings were published, no mention, the Lateran was not mentioned at all. Körte held a scholarship at the Biblioteca Herziana in Rome in the early 1930s, where Rudolf Wittkower and Richard Krautheimer were his colleagues and friends. Interest in Piranesi's architecture was evidently growing at the Biblioteca Herziana at that time. A committed Nazi, apparently with tears in his eyes, Körte broke off all relations with his Jewish friends and colleagues to comply with the Nazification of the German art institution in Rome. But in 1938, Wittkower would contribute much to the scholarship on Piranesi as an architectural theoretician, but without any analysis of the Priorato, for which he correctly referred to Körte's essay, and we may add very generously, maybe bravely, without any resentment. It's, of course, a dramatic story. Heinrich Brauer, Körte and Wittkower's colleagues at the Herziana in the early 1930s would be the first to publish Piranesi's drawings for the Priorato from the collection of Berlin's Kunstbibliothek in 1961. Only in 1948 were the Morgan drawings published by Felice Stampfel, and in the late 1960s, they were thoroughly analyzed by Manfred Fischer in a seminal work on Piranesi's architectural practice. Piranesi is indeed a paper architect, as he himself states in his first work, the Prima parte di Architetture e Prospettive in 1743, quote, "No other possibility do I see left to me and to any other modern architects than to explain my ideas through drawings." Architectural drawing falls into a different category of draftsmanship. Architects sketch and draw, but they also survey and measure. They conceive their three-dimensional spaces, but must be able to render them in 2 dimensions through measured plans, elevations, and sections. Architectural drawings represent space, statics, loads, proportions, and convey technical information, not only stylistic ideas. Architecture is a mediated form of art, a complex teamwork. Autography in architecture refers to different relations between the artist and his work of art, and autography in architectural drawing is probably a slightly different thing as well. Like all professional architects, Piranesi supervises the whole process of design. He sketches with red chalk, pen, and ink, as he draws with ruler and divider with the same expertise. Trained as an architect in Venice, developing his architectural and drawing skills in Rome, Piranesi's architectural drawings are indeed faultless. But above all, Piranesi's drawings come from a mind that thought in architecture. He expressed himself principally in architectural means, objects such as vases, analysis of techniques of buildings, quick glances at angles of views of Roman buildings seen as pure volumes, and of course complex mind palaces. Piranesi used his drawing skills skill and volcanic creativity to force correct academic technical codes of architectural representation into a new world of his own invention. The plan of a spacious and magnificent college, 1750, is an early expression of this frame of mind. And Mariette, the French scholar and collector, noted the absurdity of Piranesi's impossible reconstructions of ancient Roman structures. He commented on this etching specifically, rendered with exact technical codes, as if they had been actually surveyed by a technician, but totally absurd in their gigantic reconstruction. Piranesi's spirit was architecture, though he had no success as an architect. Perhaps he did not want to be a successful architect, drawing and etching being the only viable ways to express his wild imagination. Even his imaginative three-dimensional spaces, above all the carceri, devoid of any static and constructive logic, unexpectedly find resonance in today's deconstructivist and liquid design. Thank you.
Our last speaker this afternoon is Christoph Frank, who is a professor in the Academy of Architecture at the Università della Svizzera Italiana. His broad expertise ranges widely across the art world of the 18th century, studying fields such as collecting history and the correspondence of artists and agents. Christoph was, as we've heard, part of the team that investigated the Karlsruhe albums, and in connection with that, he spent the spring of 2018 here in New York. He spent weeks in our study room, a wonderful collegial presence, and his work contributes to the exhibition and my publication in innumerable ways. For the conference, I've asked him to make use of some of the research he did in Karlsruhe, here, Stockholm, and many other places, looking also at artistic correspondences to help us learn more, not about Battista, but about his son, Francesco Piranesi. Christoph.
Yes, good evening. I shall speak freely. First of all, I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart the Morgan Library and Museum, the Thor Institute of Drawing, all the wonderful colleagues and the director in this house. As an academic teacher, I was always profoundly impressed, not only about the accessibility of American cultural institutions and their holdings. In 2018, when I held a Weinberg Fellowship at Columbia, it was one of the most profound experiences for me to be welcomed everywhere and to find everything on my desk I could potentially imagine or desire to see. And I would like to extend a particular thanks once again also to John on this occasion, because he reaches out to the academic succession. And you may have thought that this brief talk tonight will be perhaps the last chapter of Succession. I understand that the TV serial seems to have come to an end. I'm not going to reveal who actually succeeded anyway, but we have a similar kind of problematic here. In many ways, and it touches, yes, this son, Francesco, and perhaps I should only say I was, trained at the Warburg Institute. For me, sources and particular manuscript sources are very important, and one of my academic teachers was Ernst Gombrich, who always said, and we've got the document to prove it. So when the project emerged in 2014, 2015 with Georg and then my Ph.D. student also Benedict Maroni at Mendrisio, I thought, what can I contribute to some extent? I've been studying for a long, long time artistic correspondences in the second half of the 18th century, and it's a paradox. If you really want to find the narratives of Rome, you've got to leave the city walls of Rome. Yes, indeed, you've got to go to England and to France and to Germany, and sometimes even less well-trodden paths, which are in Poland, which are in Russia, sometimes in Latvia, and even Sweden. And I think the project also enabled me to do more research on that. And of course, it's a particularly painful moment, I think I would like to add that so many of the connections between these societies, which became viable again, visitable, accessible again since 1989, have been called into question once again as a result of this tremendous crisis that is very close to some of us. The project re-enabled me also to go back to St. Petersburg before all of this broke out. Here, a very beautiful drawing, yes indeed, by Vicar of the early 19th century at the Museo Napoleonico in Rome. And it shows Francesco in his later years when people started saying he resembled the father. A crucial source is this necrologue, which is in the Stockholm archives by Chaudet. It's very short, and it's only got one merit, that Chaudet says on the last page that Francesco was born in 1756, which is much of a debate because 58 and the Stati delle Anime in Rome say it was 1758. However, none of these sources are really precise. So who is Simon-Philippe Chaudet? He did this publication on the antiquities of Herculaneum, again, under the directorate, together with, Tommaso Piroli, and then Francesco and Pietro Piranesi, who at this point are clearly only editorial. I mean, they really run what remains of the Calcografia after the transfer to Paris in 1799. This is a very important source. Once again, Le Grand has been celebrated throughout this day. Important passages here, which once again underline that Piranesi had no patience with matter, he had no patience with his children, and in effect he designed an ideal education for his eldest, Francesco, how to be educated, and he said, you know, it's all about figurative drawing, and I was particularly kind of weak at figurative drawing. You need to improve your figurative drawing, so you need to go to Corvi, who will have potentially more patience than I have with my son myself. And then there are some notions of landscape which were brought in by Jakob Philipp Hackert and his brother Georg, perhaps. And more importantly, he says, and if you want to learn how to etch well, you go to Cunego and Volpato, the generation on from Giovanni Battista. A difficult transfer in many ways. Hilton Thomas regarded this in his Ph.D. the only assured drawing by Francesco Piranesi, HDZ 6299 in Berlin, once again, a design for an unexecuted frontispiece for the Monumenta Paestana and the Paestum drawings. And it's a very important drawing in many ways because if you look particularly at some of the really very timid pen handling, the hand is once again, and also here this part, which reflects on Paris to some extent, from whom he is supposed to have learned architectural drawing. And then we've got these elements which are actually quite fascinating in due course, as well as the two statues. The hand has not been clearly identified so far. There's this very famous incident in again, 76, with Fosma and Arnoux. And Fosma is the director of the Botanical Garden and the Natural History Collection in The Hague, a very established figure, a natural scientist who travels with Hochepied to Italy, a very extensive journey. And once again, you need to go to Holland or Sweden sometimes to find the most precise descriptions of these connections. I'm always amazed at the sheer quality of the, also literary quality of Dutch and Swedish travelogues and correspondences. Most of these people were, of course, trained at the University of Leiden, the Oxford of the Netherlands. They do meet Piranesi on various occasions. They do go back to the shop, and there's this very famous incident where the father presents Fosma with these three drawings, which have been published and studied to some extent, and the result is that in Gerrit Jan Hochepied's travelogue, which is at Leiden in the collection, it says, you know, this morning we went rendering a visit to this, you know, famous Signor Piranesi, who has a great reputation for engravings of prints, and for the expression of his drawing, of his design. C'est une curiosité intéressante de voir. It's an interesting curiosity to see how all of this family distinguishes itself in the arts, that all the children, the girls as the boys, have this disposition, and this very happy disposition, to imitate in the best of all manners the traces and the drawing of their father. So this is where this myth is born about the indistinguishability of the drawing manner. And this is then the small drawing that Francesco is meant to supply and hand over to Fosmar, and another one by Angelo, and there's a very important, I think, explanation here, 1776, done at the age of 12 years, and it's all about really setting up the children as being very precocious, and of course, this is where Piranesi, 76, he's already ailing, he's having all sorts of problems. All of a sudden pushes the succession within his family dynasty, and of course, like so many architects, actually have this on their minds and do then as now. But it leads to this extraordinary statement once again, once Piranesi dies in 78, and we've got several other correspondences all over the European archives. 78, 79 is a particularly rich year in terms of reporting deaths in Rome. There's Piranesi on the one hand and Mengs on the other. There is also an interrelationship between Mengs and once again, Piranesi in terms of this dynastic succession element. He left behind 5 children, 2 girls and 3 boys. The eldest, Francesco, is talented and may be capable of following in the footsteps of the father. However, he will always have remorse for having once again been a cause for concern for his said parent, Piranesi, because one day he went so far as to retaliate against him with a knife in his hand. It is very true that the father tyrannized him too much, and it was the reason that not being able to get some Paolo, which is basically one Paul, by asking him for it, he set about stealing from him. And of course, I mean, this sounds like a succession, and perhaps the next one's going to be on the Piranesi dynasty in some ways. However, what was very clear already in the very beginning, perhaps born in 1756, 58, that the father was breathing down the necks of his children. And there are many, many other sources, and particularly the letters in 78, 79 talk about that. And it explains perhaps something about this desire, this urge to really adapt the children, to carry on the business. And of course, the children may either have been resistant, or they may have gone their own ways, or on the other hand, they didn't have the inventiveness, they didn't have the sprezzatura, they didn't have the ingeniousness, they didn't have the vision, which you cannot just simply transfer genetically. Perhaps they would have been happier to be lawyers, who knows. Anyway, so the 77, 78 Francesco Piranesi drawing in Berlin in many ways still remains a crucial source in order to understand something about the hand and handling of Francesco, I think. However, there are other perplexities, and of course the Karlsruhe project in many ways enabled us to turn around many, many, many stones, some of which more trodden and less trodden, and in effect we've, I think, gone through innumerous archives in order to recuperate some of the materials, and of course here also these perplexities, which turn up at Sotheby's. But the second one is more important because it carries this tiny little inscription, Casa dei Pilati, which connects with a drawing at Karlsruhe again, and which here, with the entry of the Karlsruhe drawing, again, the authorship is very uncertain in any of this, but the inscription itself is very, very interesting. Here it's been identified as being by Giovanni Battista. However, there is still room left for argumentation within these forensics, and particularly the forensics of paleography. It is interesting so that in the 1960s, those kind of Lhuillier-oriented drawings were already on the market. They were very large. If we return briefly, as you can see, these are relatively large formats. and they were on the market. They could have been discussed, perhaps. They could have been taken into consideration. Of course, nobody gave them any credibility, particularly in relation to these 19th century attributions. For example, here it is said, Francesco Piranesi, born in Rome nel 1748, in 1748. So I think, it gives some indication. There's a lot of confusion around this. As I said, there are many, many connections which have been shown this morning and also throughout the day, so I'm not going to insist too much. These are, I think, clearly Francesco, and again, they've been identified invariably also by John and others in relation to the Hygieia. They are part of a very complicated collection of about 50 figurative drawings by different hands, the majority of which, however, I would, including this one, for example, here, give to Francesco. I think they may be, and basically the material left behind from his drawing lessons with Corvi. There are similar drawings by Cades. Cades, at that point, is basically the same generation. They were born with a difference of about 2 or 3 years, if I'm not wrong. And I was always fascinated by this little drawing here at the bottom because, as you will see it in a second, I seem to detect an oval, and I seem to be reading something in this, as if this was a Rorschach test. And there we go. And here it becomes even clearer. And this drawing always intrigued me to some extent. And as the project was followed by Irene Brückle, a Payable conservator, and after lengthy discussions, it was decided, yes, indeed, to remove the drawing temporarily and rehinge it afterwards in order to see what's on the back. And why I took such an interest in the drawing, it relates to this drawing, which is not in the exhibition at the moment, however, which I did find absolutely fascinating in terms of trying to read this, and this is what we get on the verso of the Karlsruhe drawing. And the significance of this is that we are clearly dealing with discarded paper from Giovanni Battista's own drawings, which were then reused and recycled and perhaps even given over to the child prodigy. Very few drawings, I think, have been documentarily affirmed as being by Francesco. Now, Francesco, in 1779, approaches immediately the court of Warsaw, and he tries to become agent and cultural interlocutor with the court of Stanislas August Poniatowski, which leads to the sponsorship, as John Pinto knows so very well, the grand project of publishing Giovanni Battista's analysis as well as his own of the Villa Adriana, which is then published in 81 and dedicated to the last king of Poland. However, the cooperation stalls. There's an even more extensive correspondence between Francesco and Bacciarelli at Agad in Warsaw, which has not been published so far, and the cooperation leads to nothing, not least as a result of some complications with the court in St. Petersburg. At the same time, he approaches through Fredenheim the Swedish court, and this time he really manages to build up an enormously important corporation. And we see him here in this very famous picture by Gagnero in the background. He's supposed to be this one. With whatever security has been identified, I don't know, but this is the famous visit of Gustavus III in Rome on New Year's Day at the Museo Pio Clementino, here with, once again, Pius VI taking him around, and this, of course, not only wearing the polar star, but in one of his grand theatrical appearances, perhaps not atypical for a king who was going to lose his life at the opera. The result is that, yes, indeed, a large part of Palazzo Tomati is sold to Gustavus, initially through the mediation with Fredenheim. The Fredenheim correspondence are some 500 folios. They were partially studied by Carrier Lumetti and have also been recently referred to in a monographic study on Francesco by Pierluigi Panza. However, the documentation is extremely extensive, and it leads to this Antiquities Gallery, which was opened in 1794 by the chief intendant of the then Royal Museums in Stockholm, Fredenheim, Carl Friedrich Fredenheim. And this was also a job which Francesco Piranesi aspired to. Fredenheim is particularly remembered because in 1788 he engaged and initiated what is considered the first proto-scientific, if not scientific, excavation of the Forum Romanum in Rome. He organizes it through Piranesi, and between October and December 88, they investigate primarily this area at the Basilica of Maxentius, and they also work on some of the foundations, particularly of the Temple of Jupiter Stator. The finds are then published in 1796 by Jérémie-Jacques Oberlin, major antiquarian, proto-archaeologist at Strasbourg. And there's, again, a very extensive correspondence so far not published that goes into detailing, and there are some 10 drawings by Francesco which pertain to this. Fredenheim takes back 2 of these rather lovely marble tops. This is one at the National Museum now in Stockholm since 1937. And these are, in fact, various marble samples claimed to have been discovered during the excavation of the Basilica of Maxentius. So in other words, this is a crucial moment in the development of European archaeology, and it's initiated by a Swedish antiquarian, amateur antiquarian, who turns eventually artistic intendant, and his closest advisor at this stage is Francesco. All of this falls, and so it seems, and I think this has an impact on the way it was perhaps even impossible for the kids really to carry on doing what the father did. There's a paradigmatic change in the 1780s, well studied here with Giambattista and Ennio Corino Visconti, with the first volume of the Pio Clementino published in Rome in 1782. And we're now seeing an increasing insistence on the empirical study and the ever more scientific study of archaeological remnants, which is particularly amusing, once again, once you know that. At the same time, Gustavus, through the agency of Francesco, buys an Apollo and the 9 Muses, which are very, very, let's say, problematic marbles in many ways, as indeed the candelabra, as being reinventions to some extent. However, so these are these paradigmatic moments when a change occurs, and once again, the whole range of current draftsmen and etchers in Rome, Corazzini, Norchi, and others who are also supposed to have worked with Piranesi at one point or another, take on this extremely and increasingly competitive publication market in Rome at the time. One of the exclusivities is there are these exclusive inclusives. So Piranesi engages in this very extensive correspondence, and from time to time he encloses, and this is one of the first ones to have been documented, it was previously published by Raffaello Bosso. I attribute it to Francesco on various grounds, both stylistic, we'll see that in a second, but also on the notion that the correspondence from the beginning was exchanged in the most secretive of conditions. I would find it very, very doubtful that he would have really engaged talking about it in Rome. I mean, given that there were these problems after 1778, the law case with his mother, that he was, the family tried to stop him from selling, and then, of course, in 1782, once again with the Pio Clementino, increasingly so, the selling of antiquities becomes extremely problematic and surveyed and closely followed by the Vatican and by the Pope and the respective authorities. The drawing is quite large, and it is very, very finely executed. We've got similar drawings, and once again, this is a debate, Giovanni Battista, what's happening to these fountain drawings we've got at the Royal Library in Stockholm, because these correspondences have been broken up. The drawings are in various deposits all over the place. So we've got now about 20 of those drawings, which I think can be safely attributed to him. We'll come to that in a second. and to what extent they may even reflect on some of these drawings that, as in this case, as John has also noted in the catalog once again, and on the website here at the Morgen, that this is a drawing as a plan for a fountain realized in the Garden Villa Albani, which was later disassembled with the various elements reused elsewhere at the villa, and sometimes they even disappeared from the villa and were reused and eventually sold abroad. Why I think this may very well be, again, Francesco, because there's something about, particularly in a Morellian sense, we'll see that in a second, there is something about the hands, and there's certainly something about the morphologies. Some of these drawings are very attractive, including this one, which is in the archive of the National Museum in an important letter by Carl Friedrich Friedenheim, by Piranesi to Friedenheim, and it's a Ganymede, and once again, very, very finely executed, someone who's got a very, very fine line. I don't really see anyone at that stage coming anywhere near that. Of course, he's not a great draftsman. I mean, of course, he doesn't compare with the father. However, he did take some lessons, it seems, from Corvi and the others in Paris, I think, at that stage. And there may have also been a reason that after 1778, 79, once the father had died, that he just simply stops doing these Piranesi imitations because he may well be aware that he's not up to it. That would be my reading to some extent. He works closely with Guattani, who's the antiquarian, who's responsible for writing up these long analyses and rather remarkable texts about the archaeological value on what is on offer. In 1791, we find a drawing of the Discobolus, sometimes called Massimi, sometimes called Palombara, and sometimes called Lancelotti, which was uncovered in 1781. A huge sensation at the time, and he tries to get the court of Sweden interested in this, and this by this stage is Reuterholm. Adolf Reuterholm was the Prime Minister of Sweden after the assassination of Gustavus III during the interregnum of Gustavus Adolphus IV, who is a relatively impotent king. Reuterholm is, in fact, the sovereign of the Kingdom of Sweden in these years, and they exchange no less than about 2,000 letters, Francesco and himself, and there are about 28 volumes of the Reuterholm correspondence at the Riksarkivet, and it contains a number of drawings, and here you see it's a very, very beautiful drawing. It has many of the recurrent features, once again, which we find in other drawings of this group. The drawings contained in the correspondences with Friedenheim and once again, Reuterholm are all by the same hand, clearly by the same hand, and they are all drawn on paper Honig van Zonen, Honig and Zoon, so a Dutch paper that is consistently used over the time period 1783 till 1797. In 91, when he offers the Lancelotti Discobolus, it is published as part of the statue survey edited by Francesco Piranesi once again. Here the drawing is by Corazzini. You can't see this. I'm sorry about the quality of this image. And once again, it might raise the issue, is it here Corazzini collaborated to Francesco? No, I think it is actually Francesco. Why Francesco? Because there's this issue about secretness, on the one hand, secrecy. On the other hand, he capitalizes constantly on sending his products, and sometimes in the correspondence it says, I am sending you a drawing by my own hand of so-and-so. These are amongst the published drawings, and this one is particularly important. It is late, at least it was sent of lately to the court of Sweden in 1795. There are two little renderings, landscape renderings of the Villa Ludovisi, and I'm particularly interested in this figure in relation to the 78 drawing in Berlin, where you also find time and time again, particularly here he's working in black chalk, here he's working in yes indeed, pen and ink. There is something about many of the cultural drawings also about these very, very summary mouth, etc. in the early drawings. we've got these consistently drooping eyes, so this is basically a comparison between Berlin, Karlsruhe, Stockholm, going vice versa, and what we find. And of course, they are in different media, and they seem to have been drawn over the best part of the 1770s and 80s and even 90s. However, there's a consistency in this. You may dispute it or not. And then we've got this rather remarkable little thing, which is a self-portrait by Francesco in this letter of 30th of August, 1794. And here it is. And it comes with this description. Farò fare da un pittore bravissimo in miniatura il mio ritratto, come dal bozzetto annesso, che le manderò subito a vostra eccellenza, che sarà finito. So I'm sending you this in annex, one of these inclusives, the little drawing, which is by size, it's 8 centimeters long. And he basically says, you know, I'm sending you the miniature, which I think Magnus Olofsson and I'm still looking for. It must be somewhere in Sweden at this stage. It is at the time when Francesco commissions on behalf of Angelica Kaufmann and on behalf of Reuterholm, this portrait of Reuterholm by Angelica Kaufmann. There's a very, very extensive exchange about this. It is a very important portrait for Reuterholm because he presents himself as, once again, the Minister of the Arts, which eventually is a position that Francesco will aspire to. He gets involved in all of the revolutionary moments during the Napoleonic occupation of Italy and the Republic, to the extent that he actively works as a spy, and he sends both Vincenzo Dolcibene and Benedetto Mori to Naples, to the point that at least Mori is imprisoned for no less than 6 months before being eventually released on the grounds of some Swedish intervention and pressure. There's a huge interest in Sweden at the time, and it implies basically all the major political figures with whom Francesco corresponds directly. I mean, it's an extraordinary career in many ways, and I conclude here very, very quickly. So we've got thousands of pages which sometimes talk about the art, sometimes talk about archaeology, and talk constantly about politics at a high, high level. And Francesco aspires ever more to a sort of political role. And when the situation becomes more and more heated in Rome in 96, 97, he clearly indicates that he would like to transfer to Sweden and become the first minister of the fine arts at the court of the Vasa. He designs here a little coat of arms. Once again, this is Reuterholm's coat in the various roles. Once again, the 3 crowns of Sweden, and you find these various items, this on an oiled paper, all contained in the correspondence. And there's a consistency about these drawings that I believe also in relation to these eventual portrait medallions. He designs, apart from the Armfeld portrait, another 4 portraits of Reuterholm himself, Sudermann, and eventually Gustavus Adolphus IV, the next king. And here we are. In the end, he says, you know, Francesco Piranesi, Ministro di Svezia, and it is at that moment when he really solicits the court of Sweden to take him over, to potentially transfer the Calcografia to Stockholm, and in 97 the relations break down and he eventually settles for Paris. A very different biography perhaps of the kind one might expect if one sees him as, you know, the incapable draftsman, son, the delusion, the delinquent, the thief, the guy who's as hot-headed as his father, drawing a knife against the father, a drama that is related by Silva, by Timanza, by many, many others, also John Thorpe, who relates about this. There seems to have been a lot of participation of what was going on at Palazzo Tomati in the last years of Piranesi's life and in the first years on the succession. And I think it explains in the end why, once again, one needs to reinvestigate the number of etchings that are in due course published under the name of Francesco. And yes, I think the story of this succession is still not finished. Thank you very much.